August 25th, 2017. Hurricane Harvey slammed into Texas, unleashing massive destruction and flooding.
This was more than we could imagine.
Thousands of rescues, streets turned into rivers, neighborhoods wiped out. Harvey serves as an important reminder to be prepared. The biggest risk in the Northwest? A jolt from below. We've been warned by the earthquakes which have already hit us, and there's no doubt it's going to happen again.
And all this will slide, and the coast will jump 15, 20 feet.
And it could be enormous. The quake may resemble the staggering devastation we saw in Japan 6 years ago. But are you ready to respond to the big one?
Protective eyeglasses, a vest, and a hard hat, because again, we're going to be digging people out of rubble.
If you haven't prepared, start now.
This thing can hit us right now, right this instant, and we've got to be prepared to take care of ourselves and our neighbors.
This is a King 5 special presentation, Disaster. Are you prepared? Here are your hosts, Glenn Farley and Lori Matsukawa.
Hello, I'm Glenn Farley at the Emergency Operations Center for the City of Seattle.
And I'm Lori Matsukawa. During an earthquake, this will become one busy place, coordinating the city's response to the disaster. Most counties and cities in the state of Washington have a place like this.
And police, fire, and the National Guard won't be able to do everything. You need to do your part. We saw how Houstonians rushed to help each other after Hurricane Harvey slammed into their neighborhoods, floodwaters invading their homes.
So when I opened the door, more water rushed in, and all of my stuff flew out.
So many in deep trouble, and rescuers were overwhelmed.
Those of you who have boats and high water vehicles, we need your help.
The help came by boat, by truck, by helicopter. They pulled together in a crisis. They confronted a flood catastrophe. We'll confront our own catastrophe in Western Washington, where the earthquake risks are clear.
The entire state is being compressed.
Tonight, we're bringing you more information on what those earthquake risks are and why you need to take preparations for a major earthquake seriously.
We've got a full team covering all the angles this morning.
On July 24th, we spent a day's worth of newscasts on King 5 and put a lot of material online at king5.com to not only help you get ready, but explain why you need to be prepared to be on your own for at least 2 weeks, even here in the city. Over the next hour, we'll bring you some new information and revisit some of the key points from that day.
And we start with this. The ground under our feet is moving. We'll tell you why and why that's such a concern. Take a close look at this map of the Washington coast. Look at those long yellow arrow-tipped lines. The land is moving, and that movement is constant. It is consistent, and it hasn't stopped since the last major earthquake 317 years ago. Each of those lines ties to a red dot that is a global positioning system antenna. One of those dots is at Nia Bay. 21 years ago, I took you out to see the first coastal GPS antenna installed, and it's not where we left it.
In 21 years, it's moved roughly 8 inches to the north. Okay, and during that same time, it's also moved roughly 10 inches to the east, and it's also actually gone up by about 5 inches. So when it started here, now it's over here.
And amongst the wind and the windmills and the sagebrush, that GPS data all comes in here to the campus of Central Washington University.
Out there, then the data turns around and comes right back down to this antenna right here in this building. So what it means is we can get data from anywhere on the coast of Washington back to CWU in 1-point-something seconds.
Tim Milburn is the director of the Pacific Northwest Geodetic Array. And that network of antennas is measuring a lot more than just the coast. And if you look, you can spot some of them. Part of that geodetic array gathering data seemingly everywhere. That dome on Bellevue City Hall, that's one. So is this saucer-shaped antenna on the Alaska Way Viaduct. Then there's this one in West Seattle. There are 500 of them, a network known as PANGA. But even here on the campus of Central Washington University, which is not only east of the Cascade Mountains, but is a long way from the coast, there is enough squeezing on this state that even here, it's moving just a little bit.
You say, okay, Idaho, this area is maybe not moving, and this part is moving a couple inches a year, then the entire state is being compressed.
We are being loaded up like a spring because offshore there is a giant fault called the Cascadia Subduction Zone.
And eventually the stresses will overcome the strength of that fault, and all this will slide. And the coast will jump 15, 20 feet to the southwest along its entire length.
And that's why this earthquake is expected to be so big, magnitude 9 big. A quake lasting 5 or more minutes, a quake that will unleash a huge tsunami. A quake that will look much like what we saw in northeastern Japan in 2011. Some of the evidence from the last big one still stands. These trees died when on January 26th of 1700, the quake caused lowland on the coast to drop, allowing seawater to come in and kill the trees. Our world is made of shifting plates of crust. Those which make up the ocean floor are stuck, locked to the North American plate that makes up Washington. When the pressure becomes too great, those plates slip, forcing the ocean plate to be shoved below or subducted under the coast. Not just the shaking, but the fault distorts the ocean floor as it slips, triggering the tsunami. Not only that, but it's the length of the fault that will cause the shaking to last so long. A fault running from Cape Mendocino, California, to north of Vancouver Island, Canada. Quakes that happen on an average of every 250 years, meaning the next one could come any time or decades from now.
We're looking at the Cascadia Subduction Zone. The ground shaking, you can see it goes all the way across the state. There will be low shaking in Spokane, and then a tsunami that follows. Seattle Fault Zone, located in the Seattle Basin, multiple faults, intense shaking around the fault radiating outwards.
South Whidbey.
This is the southern Whidbey Island Fault in between Everett and Seattle. Intense shaking around the fault radiating outwards.
These are the 3 biggest threats we face.
I lived it, and it really changed my life and my perception of the Earth and how it's not stable.
A veteran of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California, Karina Forson is now the chief hazards geologist for the Washington Geological Survey, part of the Department of Natural Resources.
So what we're looking at here are earthquakes in the Puget Sound region since 1970.
There are thousands of dots, from less than a magnitude 1 to a 6.8. That dot near Olympia is the epicenter of the February 2001 Nisqually quake. No one died as a direct result of the shaking, but the region saw billions in damage. For the most part, roads and buildings were back up and running quickly. But a 7.0 on the Seattle fault that doesn't seem to be much stronger by the numbers, but runs just south of downtown Seattle, promises to be far more devastating.
But the thing about it is where the Nisqually quake was 30 miles underground, this is right here.
Yes.
Here's the difference. This aerial LiDAR image recorded from an airplane strips away trees and vegetation to expose the earth below. And that line is the Seattle Fault, crossing Bainbridge Island, right on the surface, where Nisqually happened 30 miles underground.
This is Restoration Point. This area was uplifted 21 feet in the 900 AD earthquake.
That was over 1,000 years ago. And unlike the Cascadia Subduction Zone, which happens with regularity, give or take a few hundred years, geologists don't have any sense for the frequency of quakes in the Seattle Fault, which is really a complex of faults on this map that likely tie together underground.
Additionally, you look at this and you go, I-90 pretty much runs right along the Seattle Fault, and strands of it cross I-5 multiple times. So if you have bridges, if you have overpasses, all of our major lifelines can be disrupted from this earthquake as well.
The rocks basically go whoop.
USGS geologist Brian Sherrod even found exposed evidence of the fault under I-5, and he has dug trenches looking for evidence of just where this fault and others go. And there's more.
In this case, this is a thrust fault, and so it's undergoing compression, and when you have an earthquake, the fault slips and uplifts, and so you can, this is kind of what we're looking at in these fault trenches. You can
that movement expected to force a localized tsunami. The wave threat no longer restricted to the coast. Seismologists expect low-lying land along the Seattle waterfront would be vulnerable, along with Harbor Island, much of the Soto district, and Inner Bay. It's also expected to travel north.
This is a tsunami hazard map of Everett, and so this is a result of the Seattle fault earthquake.
South Whidbey could be even bigger, a 7.5. Unlike the Seattle fault, there's a better sense for how many times it's gone off. Forson says 4 quakes over the last 16,000 years, but says we still need to know even more about them.
There's so much more work to be done, you know, within the basin and within all of Washington for understanding these faults and really analyzing the LIDAR and getting boots on the ground and doing detailed mapping.
The science is scary, and tonight we're talking about how you can survive and how others are getting ready.
One of the communities we visited in July was Fox Island. That community is very prepared, and as you're about to see, King 5's Jenna Hanchard returns to the island where they're making even more progress, setting an example for the rest of us.
KA7 CQR net control.
This is only a test.
This is the Fox Island Emergency Net. Today we'll be conducting a drill involving hams in various locations.
Because if it happens, or when it happens.
If it is that large of a scale of an incident, it's going to be a very long time before we get any help back here.
3,600 people, only one way in and one way out.
I love living on this island. I wouldn't live anyplace else. But when you live out here, you got to be able to take care of yourself.
135 residents across the island are in place for practice.
4 years we've been doing this, so.
They have a name.
We are the Fox Island Emergency Planning.
DQN standing by.
And also the Citizens Patrol.
Fox Island is approximately 5 miles long and probably at its widest point about 2 miles.
I will now take check-ins for the emergency drill on Fox Island.
KI7 Echo Whiskey Charlie. That's my FCC ham license call sign. This will be some type of temporary shelter. The irony of being prepared for a disaster is you're always hoping that whatever you're preparing for doesn't happen.
KI7 JKZ, Fox Island Yacht Club, Marine Control, checking in.
We have a report of a house that has slid into Puget Sound. Marine Patrol 1 and I are going to swing by and take a look. The other side of the island is much higher bank, and it's a high likelihood that some of those houses may very well slide into Puget Sound. Residents are okay. We're going to proceed down to Fox Point, then return back to the yacht club.
There's a group of people here that really have a heart to serve others. We are on an island together, and that's where I think a lot of the extra enthusiasm comes from is that we have a unique situation where we might need to rely on each other.
KI7 EWC contacting the Fox Island Emergency Planning Net Control.
This was only a test.
This portion of the drill will be wrapping up shortly and the team will be moving on.
From Fox Island to high rises in Seattle and Bellevue, the shaking is going to hit everyone.
So why do you need to be ready to be on your own for 2 weeks?
Where you really, truly have a massive humanitarian situation where you're trying to take care of people who don't have heat, they don't have water, they don't have food.
The old guidance was to have 3 days worth of water and supplies on hand. When we come back, what the Washington National Guard and emergency managers learned last year that's changed everything.
Plus, how to create a disaster preparedness kit.
If you have a container, a juice bottle, a soda bottle that you can put water in, that's a start.
See what to buy, what to collect, and what to know.
You've probably heard the term for years now. 3 days, 3 ways. This was the old guidance for being on your own during an earthquake before help arrived. Last year, the Washington National Guard and other states put that assumption to the test.
It was a massive exercise called Cascadia Rising, and the results were sobering. Why that 3-day guidance wasn't going to cut it after all. To figure out how to manage a record disaster requires the biggest drill in state history.
We had a magnitude 9 earthquake off of our coast.
From the state level down to county and city emergency operations centers, these people are among the first trying to get a handle on what just hit us.
This is a drill. The message is Old Highway 99 at I-5 exit 88.
Old Highway 99 at I-5 mile marker 88.
The bridge out on Yelm Highway is completely collapsed over the freeway there.
And so it begins, the June 2016 exercise known as Cascadia Rising, designed to find out what works and what doesn't. An exercise that involves multiple local, tribal, state, and federal agencies.
Navy, Army, Coast Guard, Marines.
A giant drill involving some 23,000 military and civilian personnel, lasting for days.
It's just there's so much more work to be done.
Robert Ezell is the state's emergency management director.
Inculcating the message in our public dialogue, in our society, in our schools, so that the people who live here really truly get it, understand the gravity of the situation, and the need to take care of themselves.
What led to Cascadia Rising was a 2011 study by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Further analysis by the Washington National Guard concluded that 8,440 people will be killed by the initial earthquake and tsunami. 12,114 will be injured. 507,000 buildings, homes, and apartments destroyed or damaged. Over 1.25 million people will need food and water. The same for more than 750,000 pets. Nearly 500,000 people will need emergency shelter.
The worst of the worst would be sometime in the middle of February, where soils are saturated, it's cold, you have a winter storm coming in, you have snow and ice on the ground.
Cascadia Rising was set in June, the weather warmer, but earthquakes aren't tied to the weather. Odds are the quake will come when the weather is a lot less pleasant. Those saturated soils expected to become landslides, blocking roads and wiping out homes. Not unlike the 2014 Oso landslide, which killed 43, the deadliest landslide in U.S. history.
Where you really, truly have a massive humanitarian situation where you're trying to take care of people who don't have heat, they don't have water, they don't have food, the things that they need to just basically sustain life. That's what really, really, truly gives me nightmares and keeps me up at night.
Whether it's June or February, the ability for government to respond will simply be overwhelmed.
So I was running sort of the guys that were running the exercise.
Chris Fowler is a general in the Washington National Guard. He's also a captain in the Seattle Police Department.
We would certainly like to see the public understand that that preparedness is absolutely critical at their level.
Why? Because Cascadia Rising was about finding flaws and gaps as well as building upon what worked, and there was plenty of both. But the biggest finding was this: where governments have been recommending people be prepared to be on their own for 3 days, simply isn't enough.
What we're recommending is that they have 2 weeks of preparedness for their families.
Because it just became very crystal clear to us in a catastrophic event, it is vastly different from the disasters that we normally experience, the flooding, the wildland fires, or even the Nisqually type of earthquake. The infrastructure was still largely there following those type of events. After a catastrophic event, the infrastructure is going to be severely degraded, if not inoperative.
What you're seeing on this map is the status of roadways, airfields.
It will take several days to get the National Guard in place, backed up by the U.S. military, pouring in personnel and supplies from out of state. We'll need them.
Many of the first responders within that 24 to 72 hour period are just like you are. They're trying to manage their families, they're trying to stabilize their houses, they're trying to understand what their resources are, and then from there they can transition into the first response sort of job.
Task Force, Aviation, Lakota, Shelton,
emergency management staff.
There's going to be confusion, there's going to be a fog of information until that sort of all clears out, and there will be some redundancies, but the idea of the exercise would be to minimize those and to overcome that fog quicker than we might otherwise.
Most of the transportation infrastructure west of I-5 suffers complete or severe damage. Ground transportation to the coast is cut off. The I-5 corridor from Bellingham to Portland suffers severe to moderate damage. 30% of the fire stations, 48% of police stations destroyed or out of commission. More than a third of hospitals on the west side of the state will be unusable, others damaged. Almost half of Western Washington's total hospital capacity lost.
What long-term we're looking at trying to build here in Western Washington is that sense of self-reliance, the sense of the government isn't going to be here to help immediately. We have to be prepared to take care of ourselves for a period of time. It's not if, it's when.
Washington State's emergency planners plan to do this again in 2021. Now, Lori, you spent time in Japan at the invitation of the government there looking at Kobe, which is still recovering 22 years after an earthquake.
That's right. And you know, people in Japan are very prepared for disasters like tsunamis and earthquakes. But even though we talk about food and water and flashlights, it can be the things we don't want to talk about that can become a major surprise when disaster strikes.
あなたは災害時のトイレのこと考えたことありますか?
This actress is about to make an unpleasant discovery. Earthquakes and tsunamis destroy infrastructure, including sanitation systems. That can lead to the spread of disease.
トイレに行きたくなる人の数が
Relief groups found that 31% of survivors need a restroom within 3 hours of a disaster. An additional 36% need relief within 4 to 6 hours. Researchers believe people trapped in office towers or rubble without working toilets could get sick from exposure to raw sewage. So Japanese businesses are providing a variety of disaster toilets so individuals and families can be prepared to take care of themselves until responders arrive. Some of these toilet kits can fit in a desk drawer. Most kits provide a frame and a plastic bag, as well as an antibacterial coagulant. So there's no smell, no mess, and like a disposable diaper, the product can be burned later. The Dokodemo, or Put Anywhere toilet, can hold a person weighing 150 kilograms, or 330 pounds. Many kits provide a poncho for privacy. Psychologists say it's a matter of dignity, especially for disaster survivors. The toilets are compact, and so neighborhoods can purchase entire cases and store them easily. Which gets back to the idea of communities taking care of each other. Listen to quake survivor Nanami Yoshimoto, whom we met in Kobe.
Community, community is important because at first, fire experiment police department couldn't do anything, but the people, neighbors, help each other.
Manufacturers can follow.
Preparing for a mega disaster and creating resilient communities is one area of study being done by Professor Fumio Ohuchi at the University of Washington with colleagues at Tohoku University, which was rocked by the 2011 Tohoku earthquake.
Usually the scientific work is not immediately connected to the people's concerns, but this subject is the one that people can learn about from the science.
Immediate and extended survival covers a wide array of issues, says Ohuchi, and it's important to talk about all of them, including ones we don't discuss in polite company.
You can find portable toilets online, and they're also handy for camping, long road trips, and hunting.
Next, we'll turn back to the neighborhoods and hear from a man whose neighborhood experience inspired a book and a nonprofit that could help us all.
Neighborhood preparedness is really sort of the cornerstone of community preparedness. And in a disaster or any type of emergent event, your neighbors are going to be essentially the first responders.
Why your survival could depend on others. We tend to think about preparedness in terms of the individual or the family. Do we have enough food? Do we have enough water? How do I even round up my family?
But in this day and age, community has really become the watchword for emergency preparedness. And King 5's Steve Bunin introduces you to a man who started out just like you and I, who's now written a book and started his own nonprofit organization to get us all ready.
Facebook friends are not useful in a natural disaster. They could be totally great, but they're across the country, or they're out of region, or they're even just on the other side of town. And when a big disaster hits, life gets very local very quickly. So your neighbors are what you have to work with.
Even though he literally wrote the book on it, Scott James doesn't call it emergency preparedness. He prefers mutual aid because changing the terminology can change your mindset. Here's how his mindset changed.
It became a running joke with the guys at the pub of, hey, I heard about 10 times, and they said, well, my preparedness plan is just simply to go to your house. You know? And the first time or two, that's kind of funny. And then the 10th guy that says that, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't going to work.
What works, says the ex-Microsoft employee turned author and executive coach, is simple. Get to know your neighbors.
First step is to throw a party, literally.
Then step up the small talk and find out something real about the people who live near you.
And you're recording what skills people have, then you record what kind of stuff they've got. If one neighbor has a chainsaw, that's plenty. The whole neighborhood doesn't need a chainsaw.
Preparedness
Amber Richards is the emergency planner for the city of Bainbridge Island.
Neighborhood preparedness is really sort of the cornerstone of community preparedness. And in a disaster or any type of emergent event, it really, your neighbors are going to be essentially the first responders.
Mentality, James says, is more important than gear. After studying relief efforts internationally, he made an eye-opening discovery about the people who survive.
They don't have a well-stocked closet full of gear. What they do have is a calm demeanor and very strong relationships and friendships with their immediate neighbors.
For all of us, a huge concern in the event of a disaster is getting to loved ones. It's even more pronounced for people who live on any island, Bainbridge, Whidbey, Mercer, you name it. Because if the bridges go down or the ferries can't sail,
there's a big disconnect between when they think they're going to be able to get home and the reality of that it could be a week or more before you're able to get back to the island.
To combat this, James has another simple solution. Simply make a list of 10 people who'll come to your rescue, and don't just include your closest friends emotionally.
They're probably going to be walking or bicycling at best, because the roads will be toast. Vehicles and our normal means of transportation will not be there. But I encourage most of that list to be immediate neighbors.
Get to know your neighbors. They may just save your life. And even if they never have to, you still win. Because you got to know your neighbors.
You're getting to know other folks up and down the street, whereas normally you might not spend that much time talking with them.
The word is getting out, and we can take you online to the state's Emergency Management Division, where you can learn how to map your neighborhood. As you talk to your neighbors, you may find out there's a doctor in the house, or a nurse, or a vet to patch up your pets, even plumbers and electricians who can help you get back to normal. We're all in this together.
Glenn, community is a good thing, but you can't continue to sponge off your neighbors. Everybody has to be prepared. And I know some people out there are thinking, what is this going to cost? It turns out that you can get the basics at a very affordable price. Here's more from King 5's Heather Graff.
For a disaster preparedness story back in July, we went to the grocery store and purchased items needed for a 14-day supply kit. In one fell swoop.
Alrighty, we've got $246.70 is the total for you.
But that hefty price tag prompted some feedback from emergency managers in Western Washington, who worry that when money is involved, people shy away from preparedness.
I think that that's a concern that I had when I first started to do presentations out, and that was a question I often got.
So we turned to the American Red Cross and community preparedness educator Deb Crosby.
So I did shop some deals
for advice on how to build a supply kit on a budget.
Start at home and look at the checklist and see what things you have at home already available for you, and things that you may not have thought were part of an emergency plan.
Things like a manual can opener, a flashlight, sanitation items.
I have shampoo,
personal hygiene products, and even water that you can bottle and store on your own.
If you have a container, a juice bottle, a soda bottle that you can put water in, that's a start. Didn't cost you anything. If you wash it appropriately and store it, and if it's city water, it's already been treated with chlorine, so it's going to be safe in that bottle.
Another money-saving tip when it comes to the suggested list of supplies is to shop around.
I went to the discount stores, I went to dollar stores, and everything there is $1 or less.
Look for coupons, Crosby told us, and when you spot a good deal on an item, buy it.
I wanted to find something that was more economical for folks.
Like this 48-hour food supply she found for a family of 4.
It's $17.99 at Walmart. I ordered it online and they shipped it for free.
Affordable items can be found, she says, and can be crucial parts of your survival kit.
Is an emergency blanket, and these are less than $1. And you can find them at Big Five, you can find them at Dick's, you can find them at Walmart, sporting goods stores, everybody has them.
But by far, her biggest message is that you don't have to purchase everything all at once.
You don't have to have that whole kit built today. You can build it over time. You can build it as you have funds. You can say, okay, today I can go out and I can spend $3. What can I get for $3?
What matters most is that you start soon.
We won't have any warning, and it can come at any time.
When we think of neighborhoods, we think horizontally. But what about vertical neighborhoods, high-rises, condos, and apartments?
It's a mindset problem because people, I don't think, are really ready to be self-sufficient.
They also need to get ready when we come back. The Pacific Northwest is exploding with jobs, and a lot of people in those jobs are finding homes in high-rises.
In the city of Seattle, there are 205 firefighters on duty at any given time. Not enough to respond to a major disaster. You could be right in the middle of downtown and be just as isolated as someone living out in the country. Here's more now from King 5's Ted Land.
If there's a massive earthquake or other disaster, people living in those shiny towers could be cut off, stuck with no way to easily escape. Not that they'd want to. The streets could be filled with shattered glass and falling debris, and it could take weeks for government aid to arrive.
I've probably got about 2.5 or 3 weeks of food. I got a lot of food supply.
Maura Fallon is about as ready as one can be. In addition to all those emergency rations, she's assembled an impressive disaster preparedness kit in her 18th floor condo.
We've got face masks, glasses, protective eyeglasses, a vest, and a hard hat because, again, we're going to be digging people out of rubble.
Her bathrooms are stacked with gallons of fresh water.
This would be enough for one person for about 3 weeks.
Then there are the first aid kits.
Wound care, fracture and sprain care, kit for bleeding.
She has camping gear and tools, even supplies to make a rudimentary toilet.
This powder turns liquids into solids, and then we've got some big, very heavy plastic bags.
All of this gets packed in plastic bins and stored under the bed or in closets. Fallon, who lives in the Enso building in South Lake Union, is an exception in this increasingly vertical city.
Because you never know what situation you're going to get into.
She's taken the time and invested the money to prepare for a disaster.
What we realized is that we really need to do it on our own, and we need to do it with our neighbors. So we need to prepare all of the infrastructure that we need as individuals to survive and to take care of our own medical needs, because the city isn't going to be able to do that.
But so many others are not making preparedness a priority.
The vertical communities are very, very unprepared.
Cindy Barker's been trying to get more people to pay attention. She's the volunteer coordinator for Seattle Emergency Communication Hubs, a city-sanctioned network of gathering places where people can cluster following a disaster. They organize disaster drills at hubs in many neighborhoods, but on Capitol Hill, where there are so many new apartment buildings, there is no hub. They just cannot get enough interest from the community.
They put out word to say, please, please come help support this concept, and they just couldn't get enough critical mass to support it.
Barker says many people seem to be too busy with work and other priorities to think about a worst-case scenario.
Not only is it a physical problem, having your supplies, it's a mindset problem. Because people, I don't think, are really ready to be self-sufficient and then also figure out how to pull their community to get through.
She points to Enso as an example of a building that's taking the threat seriously.
Really critical.
Maura Fallon's neighbors organize potlucks so they can meet one another and share preparedness ideas. They do training, and they've partnered with other high-rises to swap resources, like a detailed disaster response handbook.
Well, actually, the more that I've prepared, the more at ease I am.
The lesson here, if you're expecting your property manager or landlord to take care of you in a disaster, think again. It's on you to plan ahead and prepare.
You need to take care of yourself, and then you can help your neighbors. But if you can't take care of yourself, then you become part of the problem.
School's now back in session, and geologists are now assessing how well our schools would stand up to a major earthquake. The results are not very promising.
It's not just a matter of structural integrity, it's also the land that many of our schools sit on. The State Department of Natural Resources has completed a basic assessment of the whole state, but only has enough money so far, and much of that's federal, to do a detailed seismic study of 5 counties. There are 39 counties in the state. Again, Chief Hazards Geologist Karina Forson.
So these are by district schools that have a high hazard, and this is based on both shaking intensity from different fault scenarios and liquefaction and what we know about the soils beneath the schools. And so you can see here a lot of school districts are red. That means they have a high risk. Orange is moderate, yellow is low, and low to moderate, and green is low.
Go to the stair tower and proceed up the stairs.
But one new school building stands out because it was built specifically to survive not only an earthquake, but a tsunami. Seen here during a great shakeout drill, the Acosta School in Westport doubles as a community vertical evacuation center to get people above the level of a tsunami.
You're doing a fantastic job.
It's believed to be the only specially built vertical evacuation structure in North America so far. What can be downright dangerous in a disaster is being without your medication, particularly a prescription, which could be hard, if not impossible, to fill for an extended period of time.
You would want to have an adequate supply. You wouldn't want to try to stretch, your 5 pills into a month's supply.
When we come back, a look at why this discussion needs to go beyond food, water, and shelter. When an earthquake strikes, here's something to think about. Prescriptions. Will you have enough on hand? It could be a matter of life or death. Amity Adrisi has more on how you can be better prepared when it comes to your medicine cabinet.
When disaster strikes, food and water alone aren't enough to ensure your health if you are dependent on daily medications. But stockpiling your personal meds is difficult when most insurance companies will only allow a 30-day supply. So you'll need a plan.
So the idea would be to get your prescription refilled at the earliest possible date for several months, and you can kind of scooch ahead just a little bit, getting a few more tablets each month.
Beverly Schaefer is the pharmacist and owner at Caterman's Pharmacy Sandpoint. She says once you start your collection of extra pills, don't just throw them in the disaster kit and forget about them. Remember, all medications have an expiration.
So the trick is every year on your birthday, you replace the supply. You take out your stash and put new pills in and use up those pills that have been in that supply for a year.
It's also important to check your prescription plan. Some insurance companies will allow for a 1-month vacation supply.
And this isn't exactly vacation, but it would be something that if you can get a 1-month vacation supply, that would certainly, meet the needs of having an extra month's worth of medication available.
Otherwise, the cost for an extra prescription comes out of the patient's pocket.
Some of these drugs are pretty expensive. Some of them require special storage.
And while some people might try to conserve their medications, Schaefer says skipping pills is never an option.
You wouldn't want to try to stretch, your 5 pills into a month's supply by taking it every 2 or 3 days. You really would want to have at least a 2-week supply of medication.
Ahead, how we can strengthen our communities by strengthening our homes and businesses, quite literally. I'll show you some eye-opening reasons to be hopeful if we act. There is reason to hope. Our homes, our businesses, our schools and hospitals don't have to collapse. We can even strengthen some of our oldest buildings. What will it be like
Everything is dandy
when the next earthquake hits the region's biggest city? How much shaking do people expect?
I think a lot if we get the big one. I need to prepare better. Yes.
Depending on the magnitude of it, I think it would be pretty devastating actually because of the buildings.
Does it have to be? This picture is of a different downtown. Sendai, Japan, taken 12 days after the March 2011 magnitude 9.1 earthquake and tsunami. It looks, well, normal. Lowlands, closer to the shore and vulnerable to that tsunami, were devastated. Some places scrubbed of everything. It happened largely because the tsunami walls erected to keep the waves out turned out to be too low. 16,000 people died, most because of the water. What did work was Japan's strict earthquake standards that evaluates buildings and requires retrofits, even elaborate ones like this to make buildings safe from shaking. And even this building, inside the inundation zone, was still strong enough to support the weight of a bus that floated onto its roof, even though the floors below were blown out by tsunami waves. These pictures taken by Seattle structural engineer Andrew Taylor.
We see buildings from the 60s.
Who specializes in making buildings stand up to earthquakes.
We actually had trouble finding buildings that were damaged. Sendai did very well in the Tohoku earthquake, and the lesson there is that retrofit really works. And we don't have mandatory retrofit regulations in this city.
A couple of rounds of breakout sessions.
Since 2014, Taylor's been part of the M9 project led by the University of Washington. M9 referring to preparations for our own magnitude 9 earthquake expected to result from the Cascadia subduction zone off our coast. A tsunami is expected. That won't reach Seattle, but the earthquake will, bringing serious shaking to the state's biggest concentration of buildings.
Buildings probably from the 70s, 1930s.
Taylor works for KPFF Consulting Engineers, and the massive Tohoku earthquake wasn't his first trip into the world of quake reconnaissance. His visit also took him to Tokyo, also badly shaken, and to California's devastating Northridge earthquake, Japan's Kobe disaster in 1995, and her own 6.8 Nisqually quake in 2001.
Unfortunately, it created almost a false sense of security for this region because people consider that a big earthquake. And for instance, I don't know how many people have told me they're looking at an older house to buy and they say, well, it's already been through a couple big earthquakes. The earthquakes we've had here in historical times have not been big earthquakes. We're due for a much bigger earthquake than we've ever seen here.
That's the worry in an M9, or even a magnitude 7 quake on the Seattle fault that runs just south of the downtown core that could also bring a tsunami to low-lying ground. Much of the concern is over these red dots representing more than 1,100 buildings classified as made of unreinforced masonry. That's where we saw the most building damage in Nisqually. They're typically old brick or concrete block structures without rebar or metal to hold everything together.
But some number of them, probably several hundred of them, have done some type of retrofit.
Barb Graff leads the city's emergency management efforts. It's not always obvious and is often hidden from view, but buildings are steadily being reinforced. Telltale signs are angled pieces of steel often seen in front windows. Even these rosettes made of steel plates hold metal rods going into a building and testify to keeping walls from falling away or keeping floors attached to the walls.
There's been a policy committee who's in the process of making a recommendation to the city about how to address those more than 1,100 unreinforced masonry buildings that we have.
And the remaining work isn't just downtown. 20 years ago, we saw the first push to help people retrofit their homes. A lot of people have done it with the city's help. Contractors also do this work, and they're very busy.
We have trained nearly 6,600 people in how to retrofit their homes, and we know that at least 2,000 homes in that time period have been retrofitted.
That still leaves many more to go.
This is a model of a particular type of sort of high-tech brace called a buckling restrained brace. It's called a fluid viscous damper is the technical name, but it acts just like a shock absorber in a car. And what we do is put this into a diagonal brace.
Home retrofit devices can be found at a well-equipped hardware store. Taylor's company focuses on bigger buildings, which he says can be made safe. He shows us drawings for strengthening a building built in the 1930s.
We're looking down on the foundation. This is a new concrete shear wall, reinforced concrete shear wall, which we're putting in to resist horizontal earthquake forces.
Even putting buildings on ball bearings.
And it sits right like that, and as the earthquake occurs, this rolls back and forth and side to side, or even in a circle, and the building remains undamaged.
His company also making sure the new west approach to the 520 bridge is earthquake safe. But Taylor says overall, we've got a long way to go.
It's a never-ending challenge to get people to understand the risk and then to act on it.
Barb Graff is not an engineer. Her job is to help get us prepared and then deal with the emergency and its aftermath. She reflects on lessons learned from last year's Cascadia Rising drill that involved more than half the state. She says damage won't be even.
There's pockets of severe damage, and there's other areas of the community that aren't hit quite as hard. So there's a lot you can do to control your fate, but you have to do it before the next earthquake.
I want to thank the Seattle Office of Emergency Management for hosting us here at their Emergency Operations Center. And Lori, I've covered this issue for a long time, both the science and preparation for earthquakes and tsunamis, and new discoveries are being made all the time. It's a moving target.
You know, we've presented a lot of information. If you'd like to review it or get to it, go to our website, king5.com.
King 5 will continue to monitor developments and bring you important safety information on TV and online. Thanks for watching.